Hello, everybody. So this is my second Sunday in a row speaking to you, and if you weren't here last Sunday, I'm going to try to catch you up just a little bit. And while I'm catching you up, if you could put half a brain on me and half on your blue sheet, read my blog for the week. Because that's going to come up later if you haven't read it yet. So last week, I was talking to you about empty and full. I talked to the children especially about the benefits of sometimes being empty is good because you can receive a lot. Sometimes being full is good because you can give a lot. And that neither one is good nor bad in and of itself. Unless you're full of bad stuff, then that's really not very good. But if you're full of good stuff, that can be just as good as being empty. And speaking of, I guess the fasting kind of relates well with that. Maybe we should have done that last week, Tom. Anyway. Nevertheless, both being empty or being full, you have needs that need to be satisfied. You either need to be reminded that it's time to give, or you need to be reminded that it's time to be filled. And last week, the scripture was about feeding of the 5,000, and a young man who recognized the needs of the crowd being empty, and he said, you know what, here is what I can offer, and then he let Jesus do the multiplication. And that's indeed what we are called to do, is to say, here is what I can offer, and give it. And not try to give to everybody, because you can't, and not try to keep it all, because then you become full, and full of bad stuff. So today, what we're going to do, however, is talk about the next step, which is infinitely more difficult. And that is that if each of us is saying, here is what I have to offer, and what we have to offer is so very different, how is it that we can maintain unity? How can we be as one, which is the theme for today? So there's a couple of problems when it comes to these gifts and the diversity of these gifts. The first of those problems is that you may or may not know what your gift is. I have a few stories on each one of these. And the first one that I want to tell is about my friend Nick. Not Nick Moore. No Nick that you know, okay? And Nick was a young man. He was my age when I first moved into my college dorm as a freshman. And Nick was one of these guys who could do everything. You know, he got straight A's. He was very athletic. He was there on a scholarship. He got the girls. There was nothing that this guy could do. You know, and I looked at Nick and I said, well, I had a little envy. I was envious of this guy. I want to be better than him at just one thing. And ultimately, I did find that thing, and ultimately, I did learn that he was human after all, because he lived next door to me, and I became friends with him. But I beat him at chess, and that was important to me for the time, that I was able to be better than him at one thing, because I'm frankly a little bit competitive, and I have a little bit of envy just like everybody else. And you know, I was envious this last 2 weeks ago now at Reunion, too. For all those who don't know who weren't there, Dave Shaw was our guest speaker. And Dave Shaw used to be pastor here, I guess, eons ago. What, 40 years ago? 30-some years ago? That man can preach. He was amazing. In fact, many of my thoughts today are very influenced by him. And I'll give him credit straight up. But the first time I heard him, I was thinking, I will be a lucky man if someday I can preach that good. Because he never raised his voice over this, and somehow you felt loved and chided all at the same time. When I was a new 70, in fact, 70, my priesthood office, we are called to be special witnesses, to speak our witness, to invite people to Christ, and to do it with fervor. That's the stereotypical 70, that we preach, that we'll travel, we'll preach to anybody, we'll preach from the street corners if you need to, we'll go knock on doors. And I've done all that stuff. But when I first was called to this office, I went into this room at World Conference where all these other 70s were gathered, and I looked around at them and I saw how powerful of a ministry they had, and I thought to myself, I don't know if I belong here. These people are so much better at everything than I am. I just don't know if I'm cut out for this. And ultimately, finding your gifts comes from trial and error. It comes from having a little bit of sense of adventure, but it also has to do with your natural giftedness. I like to run. I took up running again this week. I am about 40 pounds more to go, but I love doing it. I love to run, but if you put a basketball in my hand and tell me to shoot baskets while I run, the two they don't connect. I can't run and move my hands at the same time for some reason. So there's a little bit of willingness and there's a little bit of natural ability. So there's tools to discovering your gifts if this is your problem when it comes to offering your gift. One is the spirit of adventure, being willing to try something and to fail and to be able to forgive yourself for failing. It's okay to try new things. It's okay that, if you've knitted prayer shawls your whole life here at church, it's okay to try the piano. You may really be bad. And Marilyn's saying, yes. Yes, come learn the piano. If you don't know, though, what your own personal strengths are, the pastorate and I have been working together on some tools that we're going to be bringing to you during our retreat in October. And if you want them now, I'll get them to you now. But we have these tools that are available for you to take a test, to read and discover what it is that you can offer in this congregation, and perhaps what you can offer even outside of these walls. That's the problem of, I don't know what my gifts are. Oh, I apologize. The second problem when it comes to offering what you have has to do with the fact, well, I have it in quotes, it's, I can't accept your gift. This one's a little harder. There was this time in my life in my 20s when this happened by accident. Carrie's a witness to this event, and I was blown away by what happened. But Carrie, in her ministry in Kansas City, was a young adult minister at the time. We were not dating. This is before I was even divorced. But Carrie, I don't even know why I was in Independence at the time. But Carrie said, "Would you like to come to this small group meeting that we're having? It's a bunch of it was a bunch of restorationists and a bunch of RLDS, which is what our name of our church used to be, and they were trying to determine whether or not they could unite, whether or not they could come together and worship together again and maybe form a church together." And I just stumbled into this meeting, which just happened to be the most important meeting that they had had all year long, when they were finally going to answer the question of, can this be done or not? And so we sat in a circle. I didn't know what was happening. We sat in a circle, and so they asked that question, can this be done? And nobody wanted to share because they were really nervous, and me being me, I said, sure, I'll go first. And I talked, and I said something to the effect of, yes, we can, worship together as long as you can accept me and I can accept you. As long as we can be genuine together. And the next person that went said, I literally, and I'm not using that improperly, literally said, no, you're wrong. We can only worship together if we all live here in Independence together. Literally within the physical boundaries of the city of Independence. It was that strong of an idea to him, and I immediately knew, yes, that was going to be impossible because I lived in Arizona. If you can't accept me in Arizona, I'm afraid I'm not going to move here just so we can go to church together. On the same vein, I once was a marathoner. I think I may have told this story before, but bear with me because it's a great story. Has to do with that gift of mine of running again, and so I'm telling more running stories, hoping that it'll make me want to do it more. So I did a half marathon. I did several of them in Phoenix, And on this one particular occasion, every one was different, but on this one occasion, we got on the starting line at 8 o'clock in the morning. Marathons are always, in Phoenix anyway, on Sunday morning, because it's the only time they can close the roads on Sunday morning and let 45,000 runners run from Phoenix to Tempe and back or whatever. So Sunday mornings is the only time you could do it. It's the only time they ever scheduled them. So I skipped church on Sunday morning in January. That's right, Jimmy. To do this thing that I'd been training for all year long. In fact, I'd been training for 4 years, and I was going to break my personal record, which I did, which was fabulous. But all along the first 3 miles were these people with signs telling me I was going to go to hell for not being in church on Sunday morning. And they were yelling at us and screaming at us, telling us to go back home, reevaluate your life. And they weren't swearing, of course, but they did squarely condemn each one of us as we were running. I wondered if they ever ran out of steam, because that was my point, Janie. Janie just said, why weren't they in church? In fact, the runners were not even that nice. Unfortunately, they were not responded to in love by the people who were running in the race. In fact, I believe that the runners did reply with a little bit of profanity. But both of those, they couldn't accept my gift. And this is my spirituality. My body is so much of my spirituality that if I don't use it, I just don't feel right with the world. And so this was a very spiritual moment for me, being on this race, being able to push my new limits, to see if I could do it. But I was condemned because they could not accept that gift of me. David Shaw did speak at Reunion about churches being able to accept each other enough so that people can be authentic one with another in your congregation. And he said things like, can a person come to your congregation and be Republican or Democrat? I hope so. They can even be a Husker, Janice says. Is that true, Brad? No. One of my favorite times of the week is Monday morning. I have Monday morning coffee with a handful of pastor friends of mine, 2 of which are Presbyterian. One is Church of Christ, and every once in a while we get somebody else to come along. And I absolutely love to have this coffee. We meet at Panera, if anybody wants to join us every once in a while. I used to see Sarah Hastings there at about 7 o'clock in the morning on Mondays. And I love it because my pastor friend from UCC, United Church of Christ, is so liberal. And my pastor friend from, he's an interim pastor for the Presbyterians. His name's Lowell. He's so conservative. And the 2 of them just give each other hell. But it's the best time of my week because not only is it entertaining for me, being somewhere in the middle, because I don't go to either extreme, but it's refreshing. And being able to sit with them in authentic relationship, I believe, is the mission of Christ. And I'm going to repeat that again. Being in authentic relationship with one another is the mission of Jesus Christ. David Shaw, again, talked at Reunion about Jesus' diversity problem, which is what I wrote about. There you have it in front of you if you've managed to skim it or scan it or even read it and sleep while I'm speaking. That he had 2 disciples on his team, Matthew and Simon, and both of them stood at such diametrically opposed positions that it's surprising that they did not kill one another. Matthew was a tax collector on the side of Rome, shaking people down, probably taking more than he needed to, kind of like Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus had the same job, and we know a little bit more about him through that story of Zacchaeus. So he was a tax collector. He was taking money from the Jews and giving it to Rome and keeping the rest for himself. And Simon was a zealot. A zealot would rather die than pay taxes to Rome. He would sooner kill the tax collector than give him any money. In fact, he was so extreme, zealots, that they would have today be considered domestic terrorists. By Rome, anyway, they would have been considered domestic terrorists. To the Jews, they were either heroes or extremists, one or the other. So inviting the two of them to be disciples, and in fact, I believe Jesus did it intentionally, people, to invite people that are so far on opposite ends into discipleship. We don't represent that kind of diversity in this room today. We are definitely different. But we aren't so different that we have to have somebody hold us back from each other, or we end up tearing each other into pieces. So Jesus' last few days on earth, he takes his disciples, and I'm going to disagree with David a little bit about this if you were at Reunion. The story begins in the same place on the Last Supper, the meal of the Last Supper. He gathers his disciples together to eat, and he breaks bread with them, and what he says is, "Remember me. Remember me, because without me, you're going to need me." And then he goes, he is crucified, he is resurrected. The disciples in the meantime are saying, what are we going to do? Who is going to be the glue that holds us together? And he comes back to them and he says again, and this is where I differ from David, he eats with them again. He brings them together and he shares a meal with them once more. The table then symbolizes the mission. The table is the unity of our church. The table is the mission of Jesus Christ. What divides us today? What divides us today? What are things that we fight over? This is not a rhetorical question. I'm going to sit here and stare at you until you answer. Most everything. You get to race, color, creed, money. Money is a big one. Money divides us. Politics, education, religion. What about little things? Are there little things that divide us? Sports. I don't know if everybody would agree those are little, Bev. It is almost football season after all. You're treading on thin ice with me. But we get divided by all sorts of stuff, don't we? We get divided every day. If I say something wrong, I get divided with my own family sometimes because my mouth kind of runs away with me. I do it all the time. I lose my patience. We argue in church over carpet color, don't we? I don't know when this red was put in, but what was it before? It was blue, wasn't it?
Red. Purple.
It was always red?
It was red before. We had red, and then we had red. It was purple. And then it was purple.
And then it was purple. So red, red, purple, red. Boy, I bet that purple one was controversial. That's all I can say about that. We argue about everything. Right, the color of the roof. The color of the roof. Really? I didn't hear that one. I know we argue about flex seating in the chapel all the time. Okay, so there's a scripture that I'm going to read to you that talks about these differences. It's from Ephesians chapter 4. I'm going to read to you selections somewhere between verses 4 and 15. There is one body and one spirit, just as you were called to the hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. But each of us was given grace according to measure of God's gift, of Christ's gift. The gifts he gave were that some would be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors and teachers, to equip the saints for work in ministry, of building up the body of Christ until all of us come to the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness in deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ. Your giftedness is important to the mission of Christ. You have before you a table today, and there are a host of people whose gifts went in to providing you this meal today. There's not only the host, which is those who will be serving you. There's the cook who made the bread. There's the factory that made the juice. There's all of you who are going to eat it. There are those artisans who created the table in the first place to build it. There are countless people involved in each one of those tasks, and each one of them contributed a small bit so that they might participate in this table. And most of all, we must never forget that the raw materials of each one of those contributions originated with God. So come to the table, engage in the mission, and let peace reign. It is the church that takes seriously the mission of Christ that will change the world. To be like Jesus and not to shut down those who know not the table, but instead invite them to it.